I'm Taylor Morgan. I know a bunch of you, pastor at Gather-Tacoma in Tacoma, super original there. And so excited to be with you tonight. So excited to be with my friend Aaron and Carlos and Jer, and for what we get to share in tonight. So I know it's just an honor for us all to make the space to be together with each other, to talk about things that are incredibly important. So, you know, we're here to have this conversation because this is an incredibly difficult time for our nation as a whole, but none more so than for our Black sisters and brothers. So we're here because collectively, through the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Manuel Ellis here in Tacoma, and so many others, our nation has been confronted once again with the injustice of systemic racism that's a part of the lived experience of so many people here in our communities and in our country. And so sadly, I don't know about you, but I've seen way too many people who have responded in ways that protect their privilege, that maintain the status quo, that devalue Black lives. But I've also seen these beautiful expressions of hope, you guys. These beautiful signs of people who are working hard to listen and to lament and to learn and to love, because I'm a Presbyterian pastor, so you got to have at least 3 or 4 things that start with the same letter, but really to love in ways that demonstrate repentance for complacency and solidarity in disrupting the status quo, and a real willingness to lay down privilege in order to take up the call to be peacemakers. And so that's what we're talking about today. How do we be peacemakers who engage in the resistance necessary to get systemic change to address systemic racism, right? So the idea to offer this time was actually just this really small idea. And I love this so much because Carlos and Aaron and I were at the Seattle protest on May 30th with some friends who are here on this call as well. And I won't speak for everybody, but for me, it was the most violent protest that I had been to. Cop cars were set on fire, flashbangs, tear gas, rubber bullets were all deployed. You could walk around and see people, you know, who had been tear gassed and people who had been hit by rubber bullets. And so as Aaron and I talked afterwards, we really just agreed that, man, if we were going to invite friends to be a part of something like this, we wanted to be able to find some better ways to equip people to understand what was happening, to know what to expect, and really to know more than anything how to respond. So last week we said, let's work together and create just like a little training for, you know, United and Gather Tacoma, and we'll do that together. And a couple of days later, we said, hey, we've both got some additional friends who are interested. Let's invite them. And then this week, we have 22 churches and about 50 people who signed up to be a part of this. So I think we both felt like we really hit a nerve in offering something that is meaningful for faith communities to engage in. So yeah, I hope you feel welcome in this space. I pray that this time would encourage and equip you. More than anything, I pray that you would feel just like a stirring of the Spirit in ways that sustain your faithful commitment to resistance of the status quo, and in ways that empower you to walk in the way of Jesus as people who are seeking God's shalom, right, for all of our communities. So that's really what we want to do here today, in word and in deed. So we're going to reflect and we're going to respond together. So I'm excited to have Carlos and Jer and Aaron, who will all be sharing as well. So Aaron, will you share a little bit about if you want to round out that story or why this is important to you, and introduce our speakers as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, Taylor. My name is Aaron Mons. I am the pastor at United Church, a new church. We're about 2 years old in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle. I've long been engaged in the work for racial justice, however, usually on a policy and even scholarly level. I've been to DC a time or two to lobby our representatives for bills for immigration reform and racial reconciliation. And all of this stems from a biblical understanding of peace and justice that are so firmly embedded in my heart and in my soul. We have so often failed to truly understand what peace is. And as a result, we've actually missed out on being true peacemakers. I love that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." Those who make the peace get named as children of God. It's this beautiful moment of affirmation. But we oftentimes name peace as the absence of conflict or noise, that peace is simply tranquility. But we look too far to the end of the story and not enough on the process to get there. Peace is peace not just because of what is absent, but because of what is present. Reconciliation to oneself, to one another, to God, to the world around us. That is where the depth of peace is forged. For you cannot have peace without reconciliation. And this is true of justice as well. Justice is the reordering of the wrongs that have been done and the presence of reconciliation. You see, justice and peace are inextricably linked together. So when you hear the chants, no justice, no peace, it's not simply a rallying cry. It's a deep lament that indicts us for not doing the work of justice. It indicts us for not doing the work of peace, and instead glossing over the wounds our systems and structures have inflicted on our brothers and sisters. There's so much more that I could say about this, about how the silent peace we demand is simply a perpetuation of the systems and structures of oppression. But I'd really like to introduce you to our speakers. Carlos got seriously activated when it was clear that Trump was going to win the GOP nomination. He has since thrown himself into as much activism as his job, sanity, and family will allow. He has been trained in grassroots activism in the ACLU People Power program, and lately, most of his activity is with 350 Seattle, working on the campaign against Chase Bank, which is the #1 funder of fossil fuel projects. Additionally, he volunteers with the local ACLU Police Accountability Workgroup. Jer Swigart and I met over a decade ago in a coffee shop in San Francisco where we were both pastoring at the time. Jer has since gone on to do amazing work in the realm of everyday peacemaking, from Pakistan to Palestine to the southern border of the United States and everywhere in between. Jer has a passion and a heart to equip people to be everyday peacemakers. And I'm honored that he's spending time with us this evening so that we too can take the lessons of Jesus and Dr. King into the streets. Jer, can you just start us off by orienting us around what it means to be a modern day peacemaker in the ways of Jesus?
I'm humbled to. Thank you so much for the invitation. And for those of you up in the Seattle-Tacoma area, greetings to you all. And I was thrilled to get invited into this, especially based on what I see happening up in Seattle-Tacoma right now. And so I feel like we live in this moment in time where we have a problem to solve and it's way too late. And so there's an urgency. And so if you're in this conversation because the George Floyd moment has catalyzed you into it, welcome. And if you've been here for a long time, thank you. We're standing on your shoulders and we're alongside of you. I want to say a few things with regard to modern day peacemaking from my vantage point, especially as a white male. And I want to start by acknowledging that the God and the theology that I was given have no place for peace and peacemaking. And so I think that's part of the struggle in this particular conversation is especially for a more dominant culture space, is that if you're anything like me, you were given a God who was violent, conquering, domineering, probably was constructed to be a white male violent version of God's self. And in like following that kind of God and a theology shaped around that kind of God leaves very little space for the interruption of the unjust status quo. I was groomed into a faith that said that God actually cares about and prioritizes my accumulation of abundance, wealth, and safety, and that I am actually validated to use violence to protect all of those things. And so for me, the transformation that it's taken me finding myself in beautifully bizarre places around the world, around our country, and around my own neighborhood, to begin to recognize that the construction of God that I was given and groomed in as a white male in this country was just not good. It's not a theology that's been worth my life at all. And so it's been in more of the unsettling places where I've gotten proximate to pain and the perspectives of occupied, oppressed, and crushed people, that I began to capture a vision for a theology around a God who is restorative and 100% committed to the liberation of all things. And so it's interesting how our experiences begin to reformat our theology, right? And so if we're going to enter into a conversation, especially as people of faith and faith leaders, about peacemaking, the first thing I want to say is that peacemaking is not an add-on to our faith. It's central to our faith. It is the central expression of what it means, in my case, to follow in the Jesus way. And so if we're going to try to maintain a theology around a God who is powerful, violent, dominant, conqueror, and then attach some peacemaking practices, it's just the tissue will reject the practices. If we're serious about this as people of faith, actually entering the trenches, not just thinking about peace and talking about peace, but actually joining God and others in remaking the world, we're going to have to go through a serious process of theological renovation in order to get there. I assume many of you have been on that journey. If some of you, though, are newer to this, thinking, okay, maybe there is some theological work I need to do. From my point of view, when we're looking, again, from a Christian tradition, Colossians chapter 1, I think we see at the cross that restoration is the mission of God. And if restoration is the mission of God, that makes peacemaking the vocation of God's people. And so we don't have to be confused about what mission is as people of faith. Mission is to join God and one another in remaking all the broken things in this world. And so, in other words, we don't just have some kind of loose invitation into the work of everyday peacemaking. We're commissioned into the restorative revolution. In other words, Paul is writing in Colossians 1 that God waged a decisive peace in Jesus, and it becomes real when folk like you and I get off our chairs and get into the streets and actually participate in fixing the broken things. So that's a mandate of our faith. It's central. It's a central expression to it. The question, though, that I think often becomes, what does it look like, though, to be an everyday peacemaker? From our point of view, again, as faith leaders, we're looking at this through the lenses of the Christian Bible, and recognize that there was actually divine pattern, divine rhythm, activity of everyday peacemaking that shows up throughout the text. I'm going to start in Genesis, and then I'm going to hit a couple different repetitions of this to set up these 4 practices. And then I'm going to talk about maybe some of the stakes of what this looks like in our own lives. But from our point of view, when we read the meta-narrative of the scriptures, we recognize that we have a God who is 100% committed to the restoration of all things the moment we reach for the fruit of power and shattered shalom. Okay, and so God, whose name is peace, became the great peacemaker the moment that we shattered shalom by reaching for power. What we see happen in the garden, though, I think is really interesting in that particular story, is the first thing that God does is God sees it. God sees our humanity, our dignity, God's image in us. God sees the reality of severed shalom, and it doesn't cause God to end the story. So that's really good news. So God sees it. God doesn't just notice it and continue to move on. What God sees in that moment stops God dead in God's tracks, and that becomes the most important thing in the world to God. Second thing that God does is God immerses into the radical center of the story. Right? Like, God doesn't remain distant or aloof, and God doesn't come in with a club and a lightning bolt. God enters in, and God's posture is that of walking in the cool of the garden, equipped with compassion and curiosity. And so we have a peacemaking, liberating God who sees us, enters into the reality of our broken story, equipped with compassion and curiosity. God asks a question: where are you? Because we were hiding from ourselves, from one another, and from God. And what happens in that conversation is we begin to recognize how costly it is that shalom was shattered, and how costly it's going to be for it to be restored. We begin to recognize that restoration is going to require that we contend at the shedding of blood. It's going to cost life in order for life to be restored. And so there we see this third practice of contending. And when God contends, God doesn't get even with humanity because we reach for the fruit of power. God got creative. In this moment, God took the skins of animals, let some blood in order to cover the shame so that the people could be about the mission of restoration on the planet. And then God begins to promise them that the shalom that they shattered is one day going to be restored, and that God's going to do it in a unique, godlike kind of way. So see, immerse, contend, and restore emerge right away in the opening myth around what it means to be what God looked like as an everyday peacemaker and what this invitation into the restorative revolution might look like for us. I think we see that divine pattern play out all through the scriptures, a God who sees, immerses, contends, and promises restoration. We see it in the chains in Egypt. We see it in the wilderness wander as they're migrating from Egypt into the future. We hear it again in the cries of the people and the answers through the prophets in Babylon, a God who sees you. I see you and I hear your cries, and I'm about to immerse into the radical center of your story unlike I ever have before. And it's going to be costly. I'm going to contend with my own blood, and that contending is going to bring about the restoration of all things. So repeatedly throughout the Hebrew scriptures and then into the Gospels, we discover a God who has seen us in Jesus, a God who has immersed into our story, a God who contends in all sorts of creative ways, ultimately not through military overthrow, but through self-sacrifice. And then the empty tomb indicates that restoration has been complete. God waged a decisive peace in Jesus, and it worked. And now becomes real as we join God in the restoration of all things. How do we do that? Very quickly, we become women and men who learn how to see, immerse, and contend. And as we learn how to do those things, restoration begins to spring to life all around us. Now, let me dial just a bit deeper down into see, immerse, contend. And I think if you've got questions and things pop for you, throw them in the comment section or the Q&A, because let's party. But here's the thing. Seeing, there's a great difference between noticing and seeing. Notice, I can notice a thing and remain relatively unmoved by it. I don't have to get proximate to it, but when I see it, it draws me into its space. So there's a dangerous gap between noticing and seeing. Noticing, I can see that there might be a problem, and I feel like I don't really have much to do. It doesn't happen. I live in Bend, Oregon. So what's happening around the world with regard to Black lives being prematurely extinguished by white police officers? That's not a problem in a 90% predominantly white city. Or is it possible that the problem that's happening in our streets is not a Black issue, but it's a white issue? And if it's a white issue, then we are quite fluent in whiteness in a place like Bend, Oregon. Do you hear what I'm saying? And so perhaps if we see it correctly, we see it more accurately, it actually draws us into the story and we find ourselves in the midst of it. And so becoming people who can see ourselves and others and God and the world and the pain and plight and our own contributions to what's broken around us, that's the first practice of becoming an everyday peacemaker. Second, immerse. That means that we have to learn how to step off the road of comfort and into reality. Now, for those of us who identify as white and recognize we're beginning to become fluent in whiteness, which, as I understand whiteness, it is a system designed by powerful European men to protect their accumulation of abundance and power and safety, right? Whiteness is the thing that puts white on top, Black on bottom, and becomes the standard. And so with whiteness, like, privilege is automatic, violence is acceptable. You know what I'm saying? So like everything is measured off my whiteness. When I immerse, I literally swim in a stream that was designed to flow in the direction of my success. When I immerse, I actually have to get myself up out of that and into a completely different story. I have to choose to step off the road of comfort and into a reality. This is incarnation. This is the stuff of proximity. And this is the step that we are terrible at, because as dominant culture peacemakers, we've been given the following framework: notice, diagnose, solve, and then walk away, usually congratulating ourselves. To immerse means that we get in the fray and we're there a long time before we even grow fluent in anything. Immersion is the space where we're sitting in the back of the rooms when people are talking about systems that we know nothing about, but they're fluent in. Immersion is when we feel really uncomfortable, when a more accurate history starts to emerge around how we got where we got, and we're starting to feel indicted and exposed. When you're feeling indicted and exposed, you know that you're immersing long enough, and you need to probably immerse a bit longer. So this is the space of deep dissonance. This is when we're proximate to the pain, not with anything to say, not with an agenda, not with power. We have resources, but we have no idea how to deploy them because we haven't listened long enough. So immersion is stepping off the road of comfort into reality and listening longer than feels comfortable. We equip ourselves with compassion and curiosity and little else. Then, once we've first seen and immersed, and these are kind of a yin and yang. I don't know if one starts and one finishes or what, but there's two different practices there in see and immerse. It's only once we've seen and immersed that we understand what it means to contend. And again, for far too long, we've looked way out here at the streets and we said, you know what they need? You know what we should do? You know what we should organize? You know the solution that we should throw at them? When in reality, the solutions to the injustices that have plagued the impacted communities have been germinating within their souls for generations. We just simply have not been close enough to them to listen and then amplify and then get behind and then redeploy our resources on behalf of their solutions, right? So we have no idea how to contend until we first seen and immerse. We believe that if we can become women and men who learn how to see, immerse, and contend, we will find ourselves a part of the restorative revolution, literally joining God and one another in remaking the world. Now, I sound optimistic. This is hard as hell. And for those of you who have been in the game for a long time, you know that. For those of you who are just stepping in, please do not misunderstand what might feel in some places in the country like the slow simmering of the protest. This is the movement where we put our foot on the gas pedal, both in terms of our own interior formation, in terms of our peacemaking presence, and in terms of our organizing. The last thing I'll throw out, because they asked me to, is just a couple of like loose ideas around like the reality. And I want to talk a little bit about the cost of this. Okay. So let me just hit these 4 things and then I'm out. Number one, we have to understand that peacemaking is very different than peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is maintaining the status quo, which usually maintains an oppressor and the oppressed. Peacekeeping allows the oppressor to continue to oppress, and we invite the oppressed to just be quiet about it, just absorb it better, right? Peacemaking is wildly disruptive. So please don't misunderstand everyday peacemaking as like this kumbaya, we dip the bread in the hummus and have some great conversations and feel emotionally up about one another. No, if you look at peacemaking historically, it has never gone well for peacemakers because our job is first and foremost to disrupt the violence of the status quo. And I can't wait to hear what Carlos has to say about that and some strategies that we can do that. So number one, know that it is destructive. Yes, it's restorative. I'll get to that in point 4, but it usually starts by being disruptive. And for many of you, you're going to feel the disruptions as you even begin to talk about this stuff, much less lead your congregations or your faith communities into this. It is going to be wildly disruptive. And it doesn't matter the container. Like I was on a call tonight with a church that I just did a preach on whiteness on. I was on a call tonight with a bunch of folk. It was the conservative white 70-year-old woman who was like, finally, I feel like I'm seeing the Matrix. And it was the progressive guy that was hot and bothered because I dared to talk about the history of law enforcement, right? And so like you have no idea where it's going to get gnarly, but it's going to get gnarly. But it has to get gnarly in order for the world to be remade, folks. So it's disruptive. Number 2, peacemaking is not a hobby. This is not something that because George Floyd is still hashtagging that we get to kind of be about. And then when he's no longer hashtagging, we get to return to our other hobbies. This is a way of life. Everyday peacemaking, the reason that we talk about it as everyday peacemaking is because this happens wherever you live, work, and play. It is a vocation. It is how you wake up into the world, seeing, immersing, and contending to the point of restoration. This is our objective. If I'm on my commute, if I'm in a restaurant, if I'm with my family in my home, if I'm in my neighborhood, whatever it is, I want to become the type of person where seeing, immersing, so I can learn what it means to contend, to participate in restoration is the rhythm and the habit of my life. So those of you who are more streaky and you know that you like to jump into the things that are hobby prone, please identify that in yourself right now and invite somebody on this list to keep you accountable to becoming an everyday peacemaker as a practiced way of life. I don't want you to show up in the next hashtag conversation and say, gosh, 3 more years have passed and I haven't done any work. This is your invitation for this to become a way of life. So it's disruptive. It's not a hobby. Number 3, it's costly. like my understanding of the Beatitudes and the sermon, when Jesus is getting to blessed are the peacemaker, first he's describing what happens in the shaping of a peacemaker. Then blessed are the peacemakers is the pinnacle of that. And then he goes, oh, and by the way, blessed are you who will be persecuted. Because the way of the peacemaker, if we're embodying the mission of God, the way of the peacemaker is a cross-shaped way of life, and it will cost us everything. Right. And so please do not, like, to be a peacemaker. It doesn't go well for peacemakers, but the world is slowly being remade because you can't end us. We keep regenerating. Right. And so it's a cross-shaped way of life. Understand that, please. This is not a fad. This is not for the faint of heart. This is for people who can deepen and thicken their skin and grow in their resilience, because this will cost us our lives. We will bleed for this. And as a quick aside on that, I think that what the world needs to see is a growing number of white peacemakers who are willing to absorb the violence that has been directed at our Black relatives for 400 plus years. So I actually think it's going to get more costly for us in the short term. The last thing I'll say is it is restorative. It is worth your life. Friends, peacemaking is the adventure that we've been saved into. We've misunderstood our faith to understand that the thing that we've been saved into is an eternal someday. It is the life, the adventure, the calling that we've been saved into. Joy, fullness, eternity is found in the way that we live our lives in a cross-shaped kind of way that fixes broken things in the world. I can't wait to see what you have to say about all this. I'm out.
All right. Thank you very much for that. That was wonderful.
Yeah, that was really great. Can we pause for 1 second, Carlos, before you go in? Because I want to do this with both of you. And just take, a couple minutes, less than 5 minutes, for the three of us on the panel to just respond a little bit to what Jared just shared. And if there's something that really kind of percolated to the top, and I see we have at least one question come in, we'll take them all at the end, but go ahead and keep, everybody who's listening, go ahead and put your questions in now. Carlos is going to share about a little bit of a different set of material with us. And so then you'll be able to ask questions about that at the same time. But what kind of percolates to the top in what Jared has just shared among us, you guys? Anything that really jumps out for you that you just wanted to get in on?
I really loved the three things: the see, immerse, and contend. Most of what I'm going to talk about is about the contend, but I wrote that down right away.
Yeah.
Really loved it, and I really loved the seeing and the immersing, right? Because I knew the things that would fill me with rage when I started realizing the level of injustice of the world that I lived in. But then when I got to see the people directly affected by that injustice, and the fact that so many of these communities and so many experts involved had good solutions to all of those problems that were actively suppressed, that's when I really got livid. And so that immersion, I think, is really, really important to, usually all these problems are coming out of an extreme power imbalance. You need to go hang out with the people who are at the bottom end of the power imbalance.
Yep.
Yeah, that's so good. How about for you, Aaron? Anything that?
Yeah, I really appreciate the idea in there that in some respects, affirmation that we need to take it on the chin. That as those who identify as white, that we need to be the ones that step into that space in between our Black brothers and sisters and those that seek to do harm, or those that have the potential to cause harm. That we actually need to put ourselves in the way, to be the barrier, to be in some respects the buffer for them in this space as white people. That's actually our responsibility in these spaces and during this season.
Yeah, man. I mean, especially if it means that it creates a little bit of space for our impacted relatives who are actually leading the way to lead the way. If nothing else, if we can absorb some violence to create some space for them, that's huge right now.
Yeah.
Right now, it is frequently directly requested
Yeah.
Every Black Lives March I've ever attended, all of the preamble on social media, all of the requests, it's explicitly said, like, white allies, if you could come out and just make a row of yourselves around a roll of yourselves around the action.
Yep.
And then as Aaron saw, we showed up, and Taylor saw, it's like, your clergy, you over there. That's where we need you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and they specifically literally grabbed us and said, because we were collared, white clergy, please go to the front.
Yeah, that's right.
You are a barrier,
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Like every day over the bullhorns, like, white people, get up there, go use your privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so good.
Important, yeah.
What really resonated for me was when you were talking about peacemaking not being a hobby, right? That it is something, even though we might not be protesting every day, things like that, the way that we are engaged in peacemaking is so much more beyond just something that we're following on social media, we're participating in because of a hashtag. Mm-hmm. And I see that where I know that there are a lot of people who are getting engaged right now because of George Floyd, just like when I started getting really engaged. Totally. Similar to you, Carlos, when Trump was elected, and I started getting much more engaged around the women's movement. And what I found was, like, initially for me, it was like, oh gosh, this deeply affects me. And then we had everything come up with immigration. Mm-hmm. And my kids are adopted, and one of my kids' birth parents were both immigrants. And so there was just a real connection there for me with my family. To say, oh gosh, these could be my kids, these could be my relatives. And then there was a progression for me to move into, to see that kind of ever expanding horizon of peacemaking, mm-hmm. right? It's not just my personal peace, it's the peace of people that I love and care for. And then it's the peace of people all around me, right? And so even if you're entering right now and you might feel new to it and worried that you're a hobbyist, there's also this great opportunity to mm-hmm. see it as your own personal horizon opening and expanding to welcome more of the people around you, right? And then to be able to stop and say, okay, so how do I respond to this authentically from my current experience with thoughtfulness for where I want to go? So to say, this is what I've done so far. So I'm not going to jump straight to, mm-hmm. The extreme version of, protesting and peacemaking and stuff like that. But what is the next authentic step in my experience that doesn't feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not, but that takes me one step further, right? Mm-hmm. Just one more step. So I appreciate that call to not be a hobbyist, especially as a call to take that next authentic step, right? Yeah. So
to bring a friend.
Yeah, to bring a friend. That's so good. So Carlos, will you talk to us a little bit about, all of your experience? How many times have you been arrested, Carlos?
Oh, it's just once. I just got started.
You got a great picture from it.
Yeah, that was an experience. So what I'm going to talk about for the most part is the content part of seeing and to immerse and to contend. I'm going to talk about a specific form of that contention that after, like 2 years of really just kind of, I would call it flailing, but that sounds more pejorative than it really was. Like when Trump got elected, I was like, I am doing everything. I am going to escalate my citizenship. And I just decided that I would do like one action every single week for the beginning of his presidency in order to try and correct this mess that we had gotten into, whether it was like, I'm going to sign up and make a monthly donation to the ACLU, or I'm going to go read this book on white privilege. And then some of them were bigger actions. And then eventually I knew I would come across something that would take up enough of my time that basically like couldn't be a hobby. I'm like, all right, well, this is a thing I have to do now. And I will do it to the limit that my life will allow it to happen, right? So I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. What that thing is called, I have a very advanced slideshow for you. It's called nonviolent direct action. So that's one thing that you can write down and find out a whole bunch of history about. But I learned the history about it And I was very surprised to learn how effective it really is and how effective the history about it has been. So we'll do a quick chat on that. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is, if you're talking to any new protesters, especially the rapid state of escalation that protests has hit in so many cities, we're just going to talk a little bit about arrest behavior and what you should do if you get arrested, which is usually something that you want to avoid and is usually avoidable, at least as a white person. That being said, if you are white, you should get arrested and go to jail in the United States at least once. So I work with 350 Seattle, the action group. 350 is 350.org is like a anti-fossil fuel industry protest movement, started by Bill McKibben, I think. And in Seattle, one of the primary campaigns has been to shut down Chase Bank's funding of fossil fuel projects. And it was with them that I got some of my arrest training. It was with them that I have done a couple of instances of nonviolent direct action that were like a mixture of like theatrical and then also disruptive. You want the story to be told. You want people to know, customers and the press to know, like, hey, just so you know, your money is being used to help, get, fund the Keystone XL pipeline and do terrible things. And this is how that starts with damage to the earth, and then damage to your economic life, and then damage to Black and brown people all over the world. You get that story out by shutting down Second Avenue, which is why I got arrested. So there's a long history of that happening. That was my relationship to it. They advise people, they actively discourage anybody who is a person of color, anybody with any previous legal exposure, to not get arrested. Sometimes they volunteer for that duty. If we kind of know which people in an action is going to get arrested, and a Black or brown person or trans person would say, oh, I'd love to do that. It's like, okay, we're going to have a long chat with you about how you should, under no circumstances, expose yourself to the legal system in the United States. Your life will become a recipe of pain. So are you sure you want to do that? Because we got a row of white volunteers, and there's Carlos, put his hand up in the air right away, doesn't even know any of us, right? So we generally have like the bread and butter is like middle-aged white lady or a white guy. You can get arrested and you will learn more in the space of time of being arrested and then going to jail and spending, you probably spend like 1 or 2 days in jail if it's something for a peaceful, non-violent protest. You will learn a lot in that time about how quickly people get dehumanized. From the moment the handcuffs are on you, you feel one layer of your humanity being stripped away, one after another. One of your rights is stripped from you, one after another, all the way through the process until you get out. So we're going to talk about that, but no matter what I say, the things that you take away are, if you're a white person, get arrested once. If you are not, and tell all your friends, do not expose them to the justice system in any way. Okay, so we're going to go back and we're going to talk about the different forms of like nonviolent action, nonviolent direct action. So Jerry, you bring up the idea of disruption, right? So that has been the intention. That is the type of nonviolent direct action that I have become infatuated with, because of its efficacy and because of the ability of anybody to get involved. There's lots of forms of protest. There's lots of forms of civic action, but one of them that actually has kind of a low barrier of entry is for people to get involved in nonviolent direct action. You can usually get people the right amount of skills pretty fast. And then from then on, it's just a matter of organization. Something about, if you're going to declare a boycott, if you're going to make a theatrical, stand in the streets or a wild protest, the way I, as a former actor, like to do, You don't need to train for years. You don't need to go to law school. You can actually get that done. You can get a message across, and then you find out that you have supplied politicians with the knowledge that there's a mandate in the streets. There's enough political will that they can go in and implement the solution that some lawyer probably already proposed and handed to them anyway. So it does amplify a message that you want, and a message of peace, a message of justice, and it is a way to broadcast very loudly that enough people want it, that people who are in control can actually execute the solution. A lot of the different versions of it, like rallies and marches and kind of standard protests, this is like a really good entry-level way to get people who are afraid of advanced level protests involved. It's one of the things that I've been doing in the last 3 weeks, is just getting some of the people who have consistently like, hey, I liked the picture of you getting arrested, or I was really happy to see Carlos. That was cool to see what a stand that you were taking at Chase Bank. I'm like, awesome. You're going to come with me to the next meeting? Nah, I'm not going to do that. But they were willing to come to some of these rallies. They were willing to come to some of these marches. And I have figured out that that is just enough exposure to make people less afraid. And the people that I have gotten involved now, they said, well, what do I do now? So, wonderful. Let us continue. Let's keep chatting, because we're going to continue to contend. We're going to make some peace, and this is not a hobby. So with this idea that the goal is peace, the other thing that I love about nonviolent direct action is the fact that you can have disruption around a specific goal. And usually your goal is to interfere with somebody's business, somebody's profit, somebody who is executing like a specific measure of injustice, like the Montgomery bus boycott, right? It took a very long time, but that was a privately run company, and you can interfere with their profits. So your actions have a material impact on someone immediately. You have a good target, and what you need is the community to come together and simply find a way to get other people to their destination without involving this racist company's profits. So it's one thing to say the action is nonviolent in the sense that you aren't going to do specific harm to any person, but you're probably going to harm something. I'm sure you all have seen that image of the police precinct in Minneapolis, like just in a torrential fire, right? Just a horrifying thing, right? That building was empty. That was direct action. I work with groups that are very explicit and serious about no property damage, but there are exceptions to those rules. Like that police precinct was causing harm to an entire community. So there's various forms of direct action that are to be considered. Some are more appropriate than others in, what you could call a crisis situation. So a really good group, it's really great to get knowledge of the people that you're organizing with and a level of trust, especially when you're engaging in like a high pressure situation, like the theatrical actions that I participated in. These were people that had done this before. They had kind of a long track record of interacting with the police, interacting with people who don't want to see you protest, interacting with people who don't want your action, like a long campaign, to continue against them. The 350 Seattle people that I've been working with, they have a long running dialogue with executives at Chase Bank. So you can get together with a group that is well established, and you can be willing to take more risks, to do more disruption, to do more contending in order to make peace when you have that good relationship with people, rather than kind of doing what I was initially doing, which was, like I said, flailing. It wasn't the worst flailing, but it was definitely flailing. The last thing I wanted to remember, I remember you're talking about Jesus. The other bit of nonviolent direct action, right? Jesus cleared the temple. And he didn't do it in a polite way. He didn't harm anybody, but he committed to the action. He committed to his purpose that he was here for. That is probably my original and favorite form of nonviolent direct action that I would love to emulate. I don't think I'm going to get a chance for that one. Okay. So finally, nonviolent direct action. I hope you can encourage everybody to, anybody in your churches, to look into that history. It comes in a lot of forms. Some of them are darker than others. Like probably the worst ones is the history of the women's suffrage movement, especially in England. Those women essentially forced people to be terrible to them until they couldn't stand being terrible anymore and decided to let them vote. That is like the most extreme version. And they put themselves in the constant exposure of the people who are oppressing them. They put themselves at the constant exposure of their unfair, justice system. So that is the extreme version. There's plenty of opportunities, effective opportunities right now in the United States to do less extreme versions. But when you get involved, there is still the possibility that you will interact with the police. Especially right now, the biggest target, the biggest problem we're trying to solve is the police. So in terms of protest, there are a few things that everyone should remember. Once again, I have some slides, and these you can look up. I didn't make any of them up. Most of them come from this document, which you can get and you can find. The biggest one is when you're dealing with police, no matter what the situation is, protest or other, just remember that. The number one issue is to shut your mouth. The way you do that, you can't just be quiet. You have to explicitly invoke your right to remain silent. So this is just in the case of actually being arrested, but it actually applies at all times. One of the things that the training that I've received, both at the ACLU and in all the activist meetings I've ever been in, is that it never does you any good to talk to the police. It'll almost always do you harm. Even in a situation, when I've been in a protesting situation, like we have a dedicated person whose job it is to talk to the police. And if the police would even ask me a question, just simply like, hey, do you know what time it is? I'd say, could you please speak to our police liaison? Like that's all I would say. Because if I answered with the time, then later that could be used against me and saying, no, you knew what time it was. You were there at the time of the action, right? Now, I wasn't arrested for anything important, but either way, don't talk to the police under any reason. And if you get arrested, the first thing that you are to say is that I am invoking my right to remain silent. After that, this is a bit optional, but you probably want to say it. I do not consent to a search. And a search in the situation could mean anything. They could look at your phone, they could look at your wallet. They could use, the fancy Apple features of your phone. You could use your face to unlock your phone. They could use your fingerprint to unlock your phone. You want to say immediately that you do not consent to a search. And this will simply protect you later if there's anything found on you that had nothing to do with the righteousness that you were trying to bring on the planet, but maybe something else that you forgot about or didn't know was illegal, or who knows what will be used against you badly. The police have a lot of power over you to make you look guilty, feel guilty, find you actually guilty later, and it's not necessarily ethical, right? Like they have the right to lie to you, they can give you problems. So I'm invoking my right to remain silent. I do not consent to a search. And then I wish to have a lawyer present. So those are three things that you want everybody with you, no matter what action you're ever going to participate in. As we saw in the protests in Seattle recently, there's not a clear, rhyme or reason for when the police would decide to suddenly give a dispersal order or decide who to arrest. So you want people to be protected when they decide that they themselves are going to be the sort of ally, like, I'm going to stand here and I will allow myself to be arrested to make sure that one of these protesters or one of these Black or brown people for whom I'm trying to bring justice can just get out of here. So you want those people, I'm going to be the shield. They should have at least the minimum basics of their legal rights, the things that they have to say. I'm invoking my right to remain silent. They're going to say it explicitly. The police are probably not going to Mirandize you. They're not going to read the rights. That's for TV shows. I wish to have a lawyer present, and I do not consent to a search. If there's any wiggle room in the beginning, like I said, there's no rhyme or reason. Lately in Seattle, when people have gotten arrested, if you're in a protest, even if you're in a big demonstration, like in most cities, usually there's some warning. You might have the opportunity to go. So the only thing you want to say to a cop is, am I free to go? And they say, oh, I told you you're free to go. I was just wondering if you knew what time it is. Say, I'm not going to answer any questions. Like, that's it. So get that basic protection. And then whatever city you are in, I would reach out to the activist community, especially like nonviolent direct action community. They will for sure have more elaborate and involved arrest training. And they will have specific advice about, for example, if you know you're going to a protest, if you know you're going to a situation that could escalate at least to the point of police interference, you want somebody who's not going to be there to know where you are. You're going to have their number available to you. You're going to have it memorized. You're going to have it written on your body, something like that, so that you can call them later when you eventually get your phone call. That person's job will be to track you through the system. You might give them a certain amount of cash, like $1,000 cash to bail you out or something like that. But all those rules are kind of really locally specific. All that set of training I've gotten specifically from the people who know the local police very well. But that is like the next step that you would take if you were going to put people into that level of exposure. So that does it for me for now. But those three things, if you're white, get arrested once, you're going to learn a lot. You will definitely satisfy the immerse part of see, immerse, and contend. And please look into the history and the efficacy of nonviolent direct action. I'm enjoying it as much as someone can enjoy something that is like really hard to do and tiring and exhausting. And I did not enjoy jail, but I will do it again because so that works.
Aaron,
Thanks.
you're up.
That's so good. That's so good. I think now would be a good time for us to just kind of reflect a little bit on what Carlos said. If there's a couple things that, or one thing that you're like, oh yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, I really appreciated some of what you shared, Carlos, about knowing the organization that you're working with and really knowing who you're following, essentially, because you're taking the lead from someone, right? And so to find an organization that you're comfortable with, and even when you're protesting, and Aaron's going to talk about this locally in just a second, but even when you're going out, if you're going to be engaged in some public action, peaceful protest, whatever it is, to know who is who's organizing that. You might not know them personally, but at least dig around and get a little information. Make sure they're legit and helpful to the cause.
I went to a meeting first, like I was going to every meeting I could on the environment last August. I go into one meeting at 350 Seattle. They say, we're looking for volunteers to be arrested. And my hand was raised. I looked at my own hand like an absolute traitor. And it just turned out to be that those guys are great. And they were experienced and they took care of me. And even, once the action started being planned, I was like, I'll do this and I'll do that. I'll take this risk. And they're like, no, you won't. We're going to, okay, come on down. I just got lucky that first time.
Totally. I was just gonna. I was so grateful, Carlos. Especially how like the reminder on the three things to say, the rights. It's amazing to me. Like I was in my 30s before, and this is just how distant I am from ever needing to know what my rights are in the event that I get arrested, because it's just so unlikely that it's going to happen, right? So that there's privilege connected to that. But hitting those three, like, here are the three things that you say in the moment of arrest is so critical. I was so grateful for that. I wrote them down again because we have to have that ingrained inside of us. I'm going to pop a link really quick into the chat thread. Ron Sider wrote a book that I'd recommend for folk on this, called Nonviolent Action: What Christian Ethics Demands, But Most Christians Have Never Really Tried. It's a great title. One of my favorite reads in the last couple of years, for sure. So get that, because I think it really reinforces what Carlos is saying.
Very cool.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Carlos said in terms of, in many ways, like vetting the organization to which you were going to be protesting or participating with. Earlier today, in a call with some clergy from around the Seattle area, Reverend Bianca Davis Lovelace recommended the same sort of idea, that she's with the Washington State Poor People's Campaign, and she recommended to us that we should actually pay really close attention to who it is that we are participating with, because there are some organizers out there that are actually doing harm to the Black community in how they are protesting and what they're doing. And so in this space, that it does, in many ways, we can actually do a disservice. We can participate antithetically to the movement's goals and ideas and ideals. And so Reverend Bianca Davis Lovelace recommended that we actually should participate tomorrow in the general strike and in the silent march that starts at Judkins Park, and perhaps should actually stay away from the things that are happening on the 14th, because that organizer has particularly done some damaging things in the past. And there's a lot of things that I don't understand, but I trust Reverend Bianca Davis Lovelace's her insight and her authority in this space. And so it'd be good for us to listen in those spaces and get involved where we should, as they recommend, and as organizers vet the people that are in those spaces.
Good. Anything else on that, or any additional thoughts, Aaron, that you wanted to add before we go over to Q&A?
Yeah. I really appreciate Carlos's the three ways in which to just kind of handle the police in the midst of a protest, knowing your rights, knowing the things that are going to be really important to protect yourself, and also even just that reiteration that if you're white, get arrested first. Make sure that you put space between you and your Black, Indigenous, people of color brothers and sisters, that in that space, that we should be the ones that do that. Don't do everything that we can to create space that they don't go through the system, but that in some respects we use our privilege in that space. So knowing those three rights, I think, is going to be super important for us in how we create space and make space. Just making that space.
Yeah, and I think, like, as I think about the different types of protests I've been in, I want everybody who's on this call listening to know that as you're in those situations, like, if you sense that you're not ready to do something you're not ready to do, that's okay. There's all sorts of situations where, and like, I'll be honest, I'm going to sound a little Pollyanna here, but I know, like, at the Seattle protest, the group that we ended with was shouting "F the police," and I'm like, it's just a little past my personal boundaries. So, like, there are certain points where, like, you will find, I don't mind being at the front or having my body be a shield or things like this. But you don't have to participate in every single aspect as you go along. You do reserve the right to be able to some extent decide what you're able to participate in then. That said, when you're protesting too, I think part of what actually Jaron and Carlos both brought up was that, especially if you are a white person, you have privilege that other people don't. And so to recognize that you have an ability to intercede, even with agitators. I know that's something you did, you and Carlos did at the last protest, or at the May 30th protest, Aaron, right? Was to be able to intercede, and as a white person to say to somebody who is doing something that's not part of the protest, right? Who's trying to cause chaos, like we've seen in a lot of these protests, to intercede and ask them to stop, and put yourself between people who are legitimately protesting and going to get hurt. So remember that you have that spectrum, and especially if you're just starting, if this is new for you, to enter where you're able to enter, and to leave when you need to leave because you're no longer going to be helpful to the cause. That's okay. Okay. That said, there are a couple of places in Tacoma, for the Tacoma group, that I would call out where you can get more information. If you go onto Facebook, you can look at the Tacoma Action Collective and the Tacoma Urban League. Both of those are good, reliable places. And Aaron mentioned the Poor People's Campaign, and the Washington chapter of that will send out notices that recommend what protests to go to and what protests are not necessarily helping the cause. And so you can look at that as well and get more information there. Anything else before we jump to Q&A, guys? All right, so we've had a couple questions pop up. One has been, Jer, where can I get more information about the peacemaking and how to do what you're talking about? And so I am actually going to put a link for Mending the Divides in the chat box. So I think that went to all panelists and attendees. Really can't recommend that book enough. Really enjoyed it. So please grab that. And there's an IVP link there.
And I think right now IVP is it's one of 50 books that they've noted for like the free giveaway. So I mean, I personally would choose a different book on the free giveaway, because I don't think you get one. I'd probably recommend some authors of color. But if this is interesting to you, you can get a free ebook. I don't know how that extends through or what day, but no, that's there.
Great. Thanks. We have two great questions. One is, did I hear Carlos correctly that he thought the burning down of the precinct was part of nonviolent direct action? If so, how does that jive with peacemaking? It's a good question.
It's a good question, and it's a big one. So what I was trying to say there is, certainly all the people that I've interacted with, I don't think it's a stretch to say it's a requirement as believers to commit to nonviolent direct action. Like we will not harm a human, right? I don't think that is a stretch. I would argue that there is wiggle room in terms of property damage. And I'm not advocating for one or the other. I'm not advocating for burning down the precinct in Minneapolis, but I certainly understand what it happened, and I'm not willing to condemn anybody over that. But I think that one is a part of a wider discussion that should be examined, and then it should be well considered in the context of your goal and the damage that is happening when you are not accomplishing your goal. And I think one kind of example of this is the actions of Greenpeace in a way. They interfere with a lot of industrial action. They at least stop ships from coming to port. They prevent operations from occurring. That's a little bit short of property damage, but it's like, I'm gonna stop that property from doing what it's doing. Once again, no humans are harmed, and usually no animals are harmed. But it is a set of actions that is considered extreme, and some people would stray from. And I'm not willing to say that such property damage or disabling of it is off the table. I think you consider it in the context and consider the cost of not doing it. That being said, like every action we have participated in, like we have told the police, or the police liaison tells the police, there's not a single person here armed. We will not do an ounce of property damage to city property, to any other property. And not one person here will resist arrest. Like we go in with peace signs blazing. Like we are super chill. But I personally strongly believe that there are times where more measures are appropriate.
Yeah, and I mean, just to weigh in on that too, I think you're going to hear in the peacemaking justice realm, you're going to hear 50 different voices say 50 different things about things like this, and I really appreciate the way that you handled that, Carlos. I think one of the things I'd like to add to the conversation is like property is property, and it's time that people start caring about human lives. And that's not me advocating for the burning down of a building. But I think it's fascinating. And this is where I think we can do some work within our spheres of influence. Watch, if you play back that moment, the momentum that was happening in the protest, then when the building started to burn, all y'all's white friends started to quibble.
Mm-hmm.
And I think quibbling is what whiteness sounds like. We quibble. And when we quibble, then all of a sudden we lose, like the quibbling, we allow the quibbling to actually take us away from what is actually at stake here. That building is not at stake. The fact that that racist systems that have been designed to benefit people who look like me have been burning down the buildings, physically and metaphorically, of the Black community for 400 years. That's the issue, mm-hmm. right? And I'd also say that Carlos, like the illustration that he brought up in terms of the more organized action, because they say the things that they're saying with regard to we're not armed, we're not gonna damage, that actually doesn't make his more or less holy, in my opinion, holy resistance than fire in Minneapolis, And so again, I'm walking the fine line between it's not a strategy that I would deploy myself nor participate in. And I certainly, like Carlos, I certainly understand it because the ache is so severe. So what we need to be doing in our spheres of influence is start policing the quibbling. Do not let the quibbling move us out of what the conversation is actually about. The conversation is whiteness has been burning the infrastructure of Blackness for 400 years in our country. Let's keep our eye on that ball.
Yeah, it's good. Good. So what do you do if you see, this is another question, what do you do if you see a peaceful protest getting violent? Do you stay and try to de-escalate it? Do you let it escalate? If you're going to de-escalate it, what actions would you take to do that?
Just out of curiosity, how many people on this call are clergy? Is everybody clergy?
No, it's a mix of our faith communities.
Right
so
on.
Some of us are clergy and some of us are
Amazing.
part of the priesthood of all believers.
So awesome. And I love that so much. let me just say, if you are clergy, let me speak to you first. And then I want to speak to people who are new to the game here second. So clergy folk, the tools that you bring to the protest movement are your collars and your stoles. Wear them on purpose. And I don't care if you are an ordained minister and you're like, I don't really like the collar or the stole. This is the weapon of the resistance. This is the tool that you have. Don't bring your Bible onto the street. Wear your collar or your stole because it does something. It automatically gives you a role. And it's amazing when I show up in the protest movement with a collar and a stole on. It changes the disposition. My presence alone, the presence of the collar or the stole, automatically de-escalates things. And then what it does is people look to you as a non-violent presence. And so there's just something in the aura of you who wear the collar or the stole. Now, coming into that kind of experience, you have got to do the deep, deep, deep interior work to prepare yourself to enter into that space. Please don't show up haphazardly with your collar and your stole and just think that that's enough. This is warfare that's going on, and it's at the physical level and it's at the spiritual level. And you are standing in the way as a person of faith and as a faith leader. Things will be required of you. Things will be interpreted about you. All sorts of stuff's going on around you that you need to prepare yourself spiritually. Have a community of people in discernment and prayer for you while you are literally on the streets. I always encourage clergy, if possible, to be at least with another clergy. Try to pair up, and because what happens, and this is, I want to tend to this question here, the Kingian training that I'm groomed in with regard to interceding when you're seeing things escalate in a protest movement is the approach that you want to take is, and this is why you want to have at least 2 people, is that when it's happening, don't jump in too early on it. People are angry and they need to be able to express that, and sometimes to each other. And so let them do that, give them permission. But if you start to sense that it's escalating to a point of it's not going to return, or diminishing returns, or to a place where like somebody might get hurt, when there's 2 of you, the way that we've been trained to do it is to enter into the space, literally physically move into the space. Again, you're stoled up and you're collared up. And so there's something weird that goes on there when you do that. But enter in, and one person face one person and one person face the other person. You don't get the right as clergy to determine who's the aggressor in this encounter, but rather as you enter in, face this way, like one person is facing this person, one person is facing this person, so that you're equalizing the moment. You're staring them in their eyes, and just your presence is going to interrupt whatever it is that's going on, and it might be enough. But what we always do is we always look them in the eye and say, my friend, I see you. I hear you. I hear that you're angry. Tell me more. Right? So and then what you've done is you've put yourself, you are now absorbing whatever it is that's going on between these 2. If you determine that it's a place where violence seems imminent. Right? Again, don't get in there too quickly, but if you get in there on purpose, look opposite ways toward one another, look them in the eyes and say, my friend, use the word, my friend. I see you. I hear that you're angry, right? And then you can begin to de-escalate that way. If you're clergy, that is your role in the space. Protests are not meant, they're not consumables. They're not meant to be observed. You have a role to play, and that is oftentimes your role, because it's not going to go well for one of those people. New folk that are listening in on this, if you've never done this work, this is the moment when you get to shadow. Come along. So clergy who are more expert around this or have more experience, don't ever go into a protest without bringing somebody in. This is how we recruit people and train people. You can't read enough books to get ready for this. You have to actually be in the streets next to somebody doing it. That's your training. So I want to encourage you new folk to find a person, or some of you who are veterans, find a person and make sure they're coming in with you.
That's so helpful. Yeah, that's just great. I've never been told any of that as clergy. So I find that really helpful and empowering.
Good. One other thought then really briefly is, unless it's strategic for you to participate in the sit-in, like if clergy need to be sitting there, like I'm at a place right now in the protests where if people are going to take a knee, or if they're going to do like I'm laying on my stomach with my hands behind my back thing, I'm organizing my clergy to not participate in that unless it's strategic. Why? Because I've seen too many moments. That's the vulnerable spot. And there are too many white nationalists that have been deputized in the last couple of weeks, that is the moment where they're taking pot shots at people in different kinds of ways. And so in some ways, when the crowd is doing the action, part of our role as clergy is to take a step back and be a presence in protection of the action itself, you know?
Yeah.
That's so good. I think the distinction should be made. I think the distinction should be made between a protest or a rally or any gathering of people that during its protest becomes violent, and then the presence of outside people who come in and use the gathering of people as a target. Like, this is my opportunity to be violent. There should be a distinction there. The first one, there's nothing more satisfying as a Christian protester in Seattle than to go to the rallies and the protests and to watch this one. I think she's a Lutheran pastor who's at every single one, and all the atheists just calm down as she walks through the crowd. She's like a Jedi. She can calm anything down. No one can flip out. It's amazing, this power. Everybody please use that. And also when a protest, a demonstration, a rally begins itself to escalate, like you said, that anger can be valid, but it might compromise the action. So any use, not now, sweetie, any ability to make sure the action continues, the goals are accomplished. That is an important reason for de-escalation. In terms of someone targeted, that guy who drove his car into Capitol Hill and then shot someone, I was 50 feet away. I don't know what is wrong with me, but as soon as I saw the car, I ran to it. And then I realized, no, I brought a friend. I have to get them out of here, or they're never going to come to a protest with me again. In that situation, I completely agree with you. Your job is to get everybody out of there. Like, your protest is over. You need to come back and protest another day, which is the message. Aaron and I were walking away from the first protest 2 weeks ago, and we had to turn people around. Like, nope, you are going to come back and protest another day. But this one has been interrupted, and we're not going to recover it in the face of violence.
Yeah, that's good. Aaron, did you want to add anything to that?
No, yeah, I think that was probably one of the more helpful things is that Carlos shared, is that it's okay to protest another day. That in these spaces, that day that we were walking away, as we were turning people away from walking into the chaos and into the danger, that was, like Carlos kind of emblazed that in the back of my mind as a mantra, that there's always going to be another protest, there's always going to be another march, there's always going to be this work for justice, that it will never end, and that it's okay to protest another day. And even as a member of the clergy in that space, I saw that as like my role in this space now is to, like, how do I protect others? How do I make sure that they don't step into these other spaces? And so that's just a really good mantra to hold into your own mind, that it's okay to protest another day. It's okay to protest another day, and to make sure that you get yourself out of those spaces of danger and out of those spaces of chaos, and actually do your part to usher other people out of that space as well. I think that was super, super important for me to hear, and a good mantra to hold in the back of your head. It's okay to protest another day.
That's good.
I think that dovetails really well into this other question too, about like protesting with children. I mean, I bring my kids any chance I can. I mean, I didn't have the opportunity to protest as a kid, like and I look at the smile on my face, like it's a gigantic adventure. I went to like water parks as a kid, but like the fact that my kids are like part of their discipleship is happening on the streets, and I want to bring them. I do think though, again, protests are not meant to be observed and consumed. And so like they are very fragile spaces, and you have to begin to learn the signs. So when all of a sudden you see an uptick, and I'm even talking before the flashbangs and before the gas, like by then it's too late. You might be trapped in and you're going to have to wait this thing out. When you suddenly see an uptick in law enforcement, that should be a signal to you that something is about to happen, right? And so there are all sorts of different ways and strategies in which they corral people. You start to see the metal barricades go up on streets. You start to hear those, or you start to see choppers around a bit more. If you have children, that would be a great time to get out of Dodge. So anytime you start to feel like, whoa, like the presence of like militarized resistance to what's going on, the moment you sense that that's beginning to rise, I would recommend getting children out of the way. Otherwise, this is some of the stuff that I think it will groom our kids, it will disciple our kids to understand that faith actually looks like boots on the ground in the streets.
Yeah, I love taking my daughter with me if I can. So I've only taken her to one protest since George Floyd's murder here in Tacoma. But before that, she and I did some protesting at here in Tacoma. For our Tacomians, we have the Northwest Detention Center, which is a GEO facility. And so there are protests there quite frequently. And that's actually, if that's something that is something your heart gravitates toward, and you want to see change in immigration and that kind of law enforcement, that's a great place to start to get involved as well. And I found that a really great place to introduce my daughter to protesting. Some things to keep in mind are like, I took my daughter to one here in Tacoma, and they had a long meeting time with a lot of people talking at the beginning, and we arrived at the beginning. And so by the time we were going to march, she was done. So you just have to realize that if you're going to take your kid with you, depending on their age, -6, often your own ability to interact, to be active might also be compromised to some degree. So plan that a little. We shouldn't have gone so early. We will go later next time. Take a stroller if your kid's small. I know they sound like really silly, practical, obvious things, but I think they're worth saying. Take things that your kids will need. And also, like Jared just said, for all the parents, like when you get that feeling like you're going to need to protect your kid's safety, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's plenty of us who won't have kids there, that you protect your kids and get out of there for sure.
Right. And get them ahead of time making signs. When I took my daughter to the women's marches, we made signs ahead of time. So, go ahead and that's all part of the discipleship and learning process, is doing everything that comes, all the knowledge building and learning that comes before. Sesame Street just put out a whole program on systemic racism. And so, that's one of those, great opportunities to connect with your kids. So
my kids will definitely tell their future therapists about the amount of marketing I made them do since Trump got the GOP nomination. But yeah, what you're doing there is training your future activists. And I wish that I had been able to do more of that when I was growing up. But Taylor, I thought you put it very correctly. Like, no, if you bring your kids, it is about snacks, about fighting boredom. Like, they need to enjoy that process. Their needs need to be met. And then like teaching them like crazy the entire time. The safety stuff is really good. And unfortunately right now it's hard to read, because like barricades could go up and that could be the parade route, and barricades come down. For me, when my kids are involved, I'm just always on the edges. I just always know that's where I'm going to run. That'll be where I'm going to run. And that'll be where I'm going to run. You just want to know, you want to be able to split, but it's never come up. Every time I've brought my kids, at least in Seattle, it has been obviously like, oh, this is a chill day. Even the anarchists took the day off. Like the people who usually come to almost every single one and they hand out pamphlets every single time. Like they didn't even bother showing up. They're like, too many kids, whatever.
There are some kid-friendly marches and protests as well. Like our neighborhood, Queen Anne, last weekend, there was a march around the park. I know there's one on Saturday at Garfield Park. It's another kid-friendly sort of march. I think that these spaces too are important, and you can find these sorts of things on Facebook. Even just talking to different people about how to vet this space. Like, is this a good place to take my kid or my children or my family into this space? I think the ones that are specifically identified as family friendly, or like kids marches, are really kind of off limits for those outside agitators that want to do harm. I think that's just a bad look for them, and so they're not really gonna engage in those spaces very well. But I think that's a really important thing to look for. But then at the same time, also being vigilant at those spaces as well. And if you do see something that a chaos or a dangerous moment that begins to like percolate, if the hair on the back of your neck starts to stand up, it's okay to take your kids out. Make sure you're keeping them safe in that space.
And in Tacoma, I think on Saturday, there's a Moms Against Racism march across the Narrows Bridge. So Saturday. I'm sure it's for all parents, not just moms, but yeah. Great. Those are all of our questions. So I know we're at 9:25. So this is what I'd like to do just to wrap us up really quick. I would like all of our participants who are here right now, if you have just in this 1 minute, we don't want a protest to be a spectator sport for you, and we don't want this webinar to be a spectator sport for you either, okay? So in this 1 minute, I want you to write down like one next step of action that you want to take from this point forward. What is your next step? Is it learning more, getting a book, reading it through with some people that you know, maybe who are even on this call? Is it going to a protest or teaching your kids something, or, you know, some type of commitment? So write in the chat box where we can see you do it. Go ahead and write down what your next step is. Oh, wait, I'm hearing from Becky the Moms Tacoma March was last Saturday. I might have gotten that mixed up in my weeks. We'll check it out, Tacomians. And then for our panelists, I would love to ask everybody in 1 minute or less, is there just one last word of encouragement or something that lingers for you that you want to close us with, your last thought? Panelists, go for it.
I do have a last thought because I forgot it during my other bit. And it has to do with the inversion of power and the result of injustice usually resulting as an inversion of power. So one of the things that people do who have a lot of power is they spend a lot of money trying to convince the people whom they control that they don't have any power. But it isn't actually true. The time and time again, history has proved, like social upheaval, the power of the ability to protest. It's the reason it's in the Constitution. You gather together, you make noise, and you get what you want. And it doesn't matter why or who believes protest isn't going to do any good. It's not true. Protest is a lot of good. It works.
Good. Thanks, Carlos. We're so glad to have your voice here tonight. So thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Taylor and Aaron, for pulling this together. These are the conversations that need to be happening. You know, you figure there's 30 people who are, you know, being radicalized in the way of love right now. Like, the world needs this. And so for your courage and whatever it took for y'all to throw this together, and the thoughtful way in which you've done it, I really honor you too. So thank you for that. I would just say, like, the only way we learn how to do this well is by stumbling our way forward, friends. And so have a lot of grace with yourself. And I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years and I still feel like a newborn fawn when it comes to some of this stuff, you know? And so have a lot of grace, find good teachers, be aggressive at following and seeking the counsel of, yes, leaders of color, but also white folk who you see and admire are walking the journey. Do anything that you can do to get next to them and to learn alongside of them, you know, as they follow the lead of their Black relatives, Black and brown relatives. And so, but have a lot of grace with yourself. I think that's really important.
Great. Thanks, dear. So good to be with you, and just, yeah, thrilled to get to hear so much of what you shared tonight. So.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Jer, for participating in this. Taylor, for moderating this whole thing. I'm so thankful for you guys, and I'm thankful for all of the participants in the different churches that are represented on this webinar as well. Like, thank you all for taking the time this evening to participate in this. If there's one sort of nugget that like a takeaway or a parting thought that I have. There's a quote by Brian Stevenson that has kind of been lodged in my mind for a while now. It's, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And that sometimes in the midst of this, what we can begin to experience is, as we look at all of the chaos and the tragedy and the turmoil that surrounds us, that we can actually find ourselves pushing deeper into this sense of despair, that everything is falling apart and that nothing is going well, that nothing good is going to happen, that the entire movement, that the entire possibilities for justice and reconciliation are just awash. And so it's important for us in this season to actually begin to look for those moments of hope, or those signs of hope that begin to emerge in the midst of this. And during this season, the one thing that I'm beginning to hold on to and beginning to see emerge that provides me a sense of hope is all of the white people that are actually waking up to what is going on. And actually like using their voice. They're standing up. People that I thought in never in a million years would say anything because it would hurt their career or because it would hurt their image or their public persona with someone, specifically pastors and clergy, the white moderates that Dr. King talked about. They're actually beginning to stand up and say something. And I'm finding just a tremendous amount of hope in that maybe this thing that is here, this present cultural moment, is actually going to take root. That what we have now, as Jer said, may not be a hobby, but a lifestyle. That we might actually be leaning into that. So find those moments of hope. Find those hopeful signs of life that are emerging around us, because I think that will give us the energy and the boost for the long haul, for the work of justice in the long haul, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. So let us find hope in this season. Let us find hope in this space, and let us move headlong into the move of justice.
It's always a joy to partner with you, Aaron. Aaron and I have gotten to do some fun things together over the years. And I really love the way the way I get to watch Aaron lay down his privilege. And I like to share this story where there was this one Easter when he called me up and he said, you know what we need on Easter? We need women preaching on Easter. Can I not preach this Easter so that you can preach if you're not doing it somewhere else, right? I'm always like, that's amazing. I love that. That's a beautiful picture. A white guy, a white pastor stepping away from the Super Bowl of church days to say, let me have a guest come in because we need to hear some women. I love that.
That was awesome.
Remember that? That was good.
You remember that, Easter? That was awesome.
I do.
So I love to tell that story of Aaron. Thank you so much. It's so great. And I love seeing the things that you guys are talking about in the chat. Ashley and Joel, you asked if I could share the links to the Facebook pages you mentioned. Yes, I will do that. And also the thing that I'm working through right now, my next steps are that I would really like to have some conversations with clergy here in Tacoma. I am getting into conversations with people who are having a really hard time with understanding how to be able to say police are not all bad and yet still hold police accountable, right? And so I think that that's a discussion. There are some things that I need to learn more about that in order to be able to continue to have a discussion about that. And that's going to be a discussion that continues to grow in Tacoma. So that's probably my next step, and I'll be looking for some resources and some ways to continue to learn and grow in that. So, yeah.
It's the end of policing. The ebook is free right now.
Cool. Okay, I'll get that. Maybe could you pop that up in the chat as well? Oh, great. And Bring the Heat is in there too. And then I'll put the, I will, you know what, I'll put the links for Tacoma mentions in here as well. And we'll just leave it up for a few minutes. So thank you guys so much. Thanks for being with us. Participants, you lasted 33 minutes past. Jer and Carlos, thank you so much for being with us. So grateful for you.